Hello, I'm Robert Rickover, an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. This is part two of a podcast series. There might be more uh, on the topic of Alexander's term psychophysical, usually with a hyphen, psycho-physical, what it means, what are the implications of it are, which we talked about at length in part one. I'll be putting a link to that podcast in the description of this one, and probably it would make sense to read that, listen to that first before what we're talking about now, although maybe not, maybe it doesn't matter. Anyway, so we talked about the fact that Alexander's was struggling with language. He didn't have the right, his arsenal of words was not adequate to describe what he wanted to talk about, which was this idea of psychophysical being the body and mind are really just the terms body and mind are really just descriptions of the same thing from different points of view, something along those lines. We talk quite a bit about that, and the fact that if there is this psychophysical unity that most Alexander teachers would buy into, there's also going to be a physical psycho unity, or if you want to use the term mind-body, body-mind would also be accurate. And we talked about the implications of that and a lot of stuff around that, but we largely stayed away from specific examples of the body-mind direction, as it were. Does that be accurate, do you think? Accurate description?
Well, we touched on it, but
we touched on it. Right.
Yeah.
So, Alexander Technique is, I'd say, to a large extent about how you think affects how you are, right? So it's you think something, you can learn how to think in ways that are going to be really helpful to your physical functioning. But there is within the Alexander world, various little subcategories of things that are really more physical, from the physical to the
physical psycho. Yes.
Physical psycho, or which, as we pointed out, was
yes.
not the name.
From body to body, mind. If you think of it as a direction, which in a way is separating in an artificial way, but that's the way our language works. Right. And so in a way, it's the way things happen because that's how we perceive it.
Right. And Alexander goes through great detail about why he has to use these words, physical and mental, because he doesn't have a better words for them. Mm-hmm. But in Alexander teaching pedagogy, I guess you could say, there are some things that are can be, not necessarily always are, but could be more physical to mental. And one of them would be constructive rest. I think it's the most obvious example, that someone is asked to lie down in a way that's a little bit different than they might normally. They're having their knees elevated relative to their hips, and then there's some support under their head. And this is a configuration that takes as much pressure off your spine as you can do in a normal gravitational field. So it's a physical way into helping you. It's parts of it are known outside the Alexander world quite a bit. People with low back pain, for example, are told it'd be a good idea to put some pillows under your knees when you lie down. It's going to take pressure off your low back. So there, and generally the Alexander approach to it is you should just put yourself in that position and be there for a little while, maybe depending on the teacher, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that. And that's an example of you're changing the physical you in order to change your entire body mind.
Yes. And I typically, how I teach it, I do say if you literally just lie down in this way and you can somehow just relax into it and be there a while, it's going to be helpful.
Yeah.
But this is also a really good time to be using practicing your thinking and awareness that so
Right.
you might say in that case the physical is the main thing, but you can bring in the psycho, the mental, the mind,
Yes, absolutely.
to support and even improve your experience
Right.
of
Absolutely. But also someone who knows nothing of the Alexander
yeah.
and if there's no teacher around and you want to get a little idea of what it can do for you, just put yourself in that position for a little while and then see what happens when you stand up. You might be kind of shocked. So you're right. It's a great platform for exploring mental directions, for sure. But on its own, it can be pretty powerful. So that's the most obvious one. Another one that's pretty obvious is, and I gotta be careful of my words now because I gotta be politically correct, but something that's called mechanical advantage, which is basically you're bending your knees and you're bending usually a bit forward around your hip joint.
Basically, I'd say your hips, knees, and ankle joints are
all bending
involved. Yes,
involved.
And they can be to a greater or lesser degree.
It's a way of lowering your height in like which you would have to do for many things, like sitting in a chair, picking something off the floor, getting into a car. It's doing that in a way that
is advantageous mechanically.
in the term.
Yeah, no, I think it's keeping the spine lengthened and your back strong and your arms free, and that you kind of have a buoyancy in it. It's basically, we're talking about squatting, but it could be the most minimal, almost standing upright squat to actually literally, but you know, it's not the back that's the waist that's bending. It's actually using those joints of the hips, knees, and ankles.
Yeah, you could almost say it's a extension of constructive rest. Constructive rest is you're lying on a surface, not doing anything. Here, you're standing and lowering your height in a very specific way that encourages release in your body. Marjorie Barlow has a very nice take on it, that it's a conscious retreat from our ability to stand up to our full height. As you know, being able to stand on 2 feet, that's kind of a human thing, right? It took a long time to happen, I'm guessing. But she says, well, but it might be useful to deliberately go back a little bit away from the full height, because then you can play with it and start to experiment with it and maybe get some benefits from a deliberate going from full upright standing to a more ape-like or a monkey-like thing. I got to be careful here because monkey's a charged word now, but it's putting yourself, it's deliberately going back a little bit in our abilities or our
evolutionary. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
it's consciously saying, hey, I'm just going back a little bit in order to do some experimenting. And I can maybe get some benefits from that.
I'd never thought of it or heard that.
No, it's in your book,
in that way. Interesting.
Whenever it's, I can't think of the title right now. An Examined Life. Marjorie Barton.
Yeah, I have the book. If I read that, it totally.
No, it's in there. And she would, just for people who are not aware, she was Alexander, FM Alexander's niece, and a very important teacher in her own right. So there's another example of where you're doing something physical in order to help improve your functioning overall. Another one, which you mentioned in our previous podcast, which I had not thought about, is the DART procedures.
Yeah, so there's the DART procedures, and there's also the kind of,
how they came about. Do you want to say a word or two about that?
I don't know too much about it, but Raymond Dart was a scientist, anthropologist, I think, in South Africa, who had a few Alexander lessons and then was left on his own to and I think he maybe had a son that had developmental difficulties that they were trying. Anyway, they created this sequence of I would guess kind of developmental movements, but they can also be looked at as a kind of evolutionary point of view as well, from lying down face on the floor to kind of crawling to coming upright, and that position of mechanical advantages within this sequence.
Right. So
and of course it's done in a,
he was doing a physical thing, you could say.
And some Alexander teachers have really incorporated the DART procedures and what's called kind of DART work. There's a way of working with people in a hands-on way or just in a guided way in a chair, and it kind of takes you through primary curves and secondary curves, and it's going through this physical, if we're separating, sequence of movements that brings you to a different place, but of course that will change how you're thinking, aware, emotions, your mental state.
Right. So those are three examples of things that are body mind, you might say, in the Alexander world. But I've come across a couple of others. One you're very familiar with, power poses. Amy Cuddy.
Yeah.
Where you're why don't you say a word or two about what they are and why they're here?
So Amy Cuddy, I first came across her because she did a TED talk about this. Developed these poses that might include standing with your feet a little further apart, hands on your hips, kind of called the Wonder Woman or Superman pose. There's a one where your arms are up high, kind of V for victory pose, and there are a couple of other ones.
On top of head.
Yeah, I don't think that's one. Oh, there might be one like
I think that's what men do at meetings sometimes.
Yeah, possibly. And a lot of there's a lot of gender stuff that you could see in different, but there's some evidence that putting yourself in these more expansive poses or postures, even for just a couple of minutes, can help you feel more confident. For instance, I do want to say that some parts of her work were not able to be replicated in a kind of come under some,
Right.
I'm not sure, because they were showing kind of changes in hormone levels of your testosterone and cortisol.
Right.
No one else has been able to replicate that piece. But there are plenty of studies that show a relationship between posture and mood. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And,
Mhm.
and they just as sort of a technical detail, all of those power poses involve raising your internal center of gravity,
Mhm.
which is a
Mhm.
really good thing to do. So there's something from outside the Alexander world that's kind of getting at some of the stuff that Alexander people are after, but from a quite a
Very,
different
yeah.
angle. And another one that I've come across just in the last half year or so, having moved to Omaha fairly recently, for a while, my wife and I were not really doing many things in public venues. But by the end of this past summer, she went out and discovered the outdoor pool and more specifically, the water walking pathway. I don't know whether you're familiar with water walking. I never heard of it before.
Well,
Water walking, well,
yeah.
as its name described, suggests you're walking in a little an area that maybe is big enough for two people to walk next to each other. Sometimes there may even be the current is pushed against you, so you're having to overcome that. But even if it's not, you're just in water up to your hips, roughly.
So you've got obviously more resistance than just walking in the air
You've got
as you
more
walk.
resistance.
That's the wrong word, but it's
And
what?
it's a popular thing here. And there's there's an indoor one too, which she uses sometimes. And I've done it a few times. I was more interested in the swimming side of things, but one of the things that I kept hearing from people who were doing it was people were saying, this is the only exercise I can do that doesn't hurt my back. Or, people with some injuries or a lot of surgeries or whatever. Or people say, I just feel so much better after doing it. And I was thinking about that, and I came to realize, and it took me a while, and I had to talk to the resident physicist in the Alexander. I did major in physics, but I do not consider myself a physicist. But what's his name? The guy in Amsterdam. You know who I'm talking about, right? No. Geez. Anyway, he
I
is
might if you tell me his
the guy
name, but
does
I
all the
don't know.
science stuff. Alexander science things. Can't think of his name offhand. Anyway, but he's an actual physicist. He is a physicist and an Alexander teacher. And the question I had, it seemed to me that one of the things about water walking is it caused your center of gravity to rise internally. Now,
Why is that?
well, because there's this water pushing against the bottom part of your body, which is effectively pushing it up even more than if you were just standing outside, just standing on the street. Now, I got to say, physicists generally do not think about human bodies when they're thinking about their theories. And he took a long time to answer it, and he had to think about it a lot. But he says, I'm pretty sure that your center of gravity is higher when you're walking in water.
Hmm.
And
I,
that's
I,
a physical way of getting expansion in your body.
Interesting.
Uh,
I'm wondering, and it might actually amount to the same thing, but when you're in water, you might, although you said their back isn't in water, it's kind of up to it's the legs that are in
you're
water.
standing in water that's up to your hips, a little higher than your hips, typically.
Yeah. Maybe
So
something
you
feels
can't
more
walk, it
secure that
definitely
you,
slows you down.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you could even it's not doesn't slow you down like walking in water up to your neck kind of thing, but it does slow you down, and it's a different quality of movement.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, interesting.
I think it's
But
glad.
I'm kind of thinking of any exercise um or sport that people do. Obviously, you may not be doing them in a way that would seem uh, from an Alexander point of view efficient and well coordinated and easeful, but people get a lot of I was going to say physical benefit from exercising, doing something physical, and that's a mental benefit, right? People feel better after exerting themselves
Yeah,
often.
yeah.
So you
But
could say
yeah,
that's
feel better.
going.
But I think, say with water walking, if that causes you to your internal center of gravity to be a little higher than it was without the water, that is the same thing pretty much as saying there's a general expansion in your upper body.
Mm,
I mean, that's just the physics of it. And in terms of sports and activities, well, here's the thing: there's almost nothing you can do with your body that will lower your center of gravity other than going into a slump or an overarching, right?
mm.
And
And both of those would, not that they don't happen when people are physically exercising, but they definitely would hinder your ability to be doing them, whatever it is, optimally.
there's not
You,
usually not a stimulus that would cause you to do extra slumping, even if you're by nature a bit of a slumper.
yes.
I mean,
So most likely, even if you have that pattern, it's actually less so when you're doing the exercise. Maybe, I don't know.
but anything you do with your arms and legs is going to raise your center of gravity, bending
Yeah.
knees and walking.
I'm thinking how people feel often after a good yoga class,
Mhm.
which they would definitely say that's a body mind or mind body thing. But I think most people, the poses and things are the main thing, and they bring in a bit of, of mindful awareness in whatever way. Um, um,
I guess
but there's a lot of raising your arms up or being on the floor or and obviously it's might end with a relaxation, but it's
I think most
yeah,
yoga poses are going to involve
raise,
raising of your center of gravity.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's another thing I had not
yeah,
thought, and I bet there are a lot of others as well. But the thing that we talked about a bit in the previous podcast is that going in the direction of body to mind, and again, those words are not really totally
mm-hmm.
accurate, but um, it's a different system that's involved than going from thinking to action, because the second one is the nervous system, the nerves, which transfer information very quickly through your body, not instantaneously, but pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the changing your physical configuration and its effect on you is slower. It
Mm-hmm.
takes longer for it to really kick in, which again is why
Like doing a whole yoga class
you did a whole
versus
yoga class
just
doing that a
just for a second doing a part of a pose
bunch of
is yeah.
over a period of time. That could have quite a profound effect on your overall use
Mm.
pattern. But of course, as you pointed out in our previous conversation, the quickness of the mind body thing comes with a cost, you might say, in that it's transitory.
Mhm.
you will need to repeat it, quite likely, quite a bit, maybe, over the
Mhm.
course of your day. But the point here is that you can get to the kind of changes that we Alexander teachers are after both ways. But in the Alexander world, I don't think most people think about that second way as being on a par with the first way. In other words,
Mm.
it's the mind body direction that's kind of key. And the other stuff
Mm.
is seen as slightly, I don't know, it's seen as like, oh, interesting, but not the key thing. It certainly doesn't seem to be the key thing that Alexander himself was about. Getting our thinking
Right.
to a higher plane, using our thinking instead of our feelings to guide us, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
I think he was more a mind body guy by nature.
Mhm. Mhm.
He doesn't, as far as we know, he wasn't a very athletic guy. He didn't do a lot of sports and stuff like that.
Yeah,
He,
I don't know.
we do have a picture of him in a bathing suit, so we know on beach. Maybe he swam. I don't know,
I
but
just suspect lifestyle was just generally more
yeah,
active.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
So I think, and I think as we said before, having both these happening either at the same time or near each other is pretty useful, because if you just do thinking, if you're just doing thinking and you're not moving, it limits the effect of that thinking. But if you can combine thinking with movement, and especially if it's movement that's encouraging a lengthening in itself, like moving into constructive rest or going water walking or yoga poses, whatever, that's going to be a pretty useful way to speed up your.
It seems to me it could be a virtuous circle, and it doesn't,
Yes,
so mind influencing body, influencing mind, influencing body, influencing mind.
right. But I think
Da.
I think it sometimes gets short circuited. I remember when I first came out to Lincoln to study with Marge, and she was having people move all the time. She wouldn't really. And then I got back to training course, and people were spending, it seemed like hours just sitting in a chair with someone working. It wasn't hours, but it could be 10 or 15, 20 minutes. And it seemed awfully slow to me after having had this experience with March. I'm thinking, wow, this is taking forever. Not that I didn't think it was good, but I don't think it was as good as it could have been. I think if there had been at least some movement, if it's chair work, getting the person to bend for, rotate forward around their sits bones and back, that kind of thing. And that actually reminds me that the little aspect of another aspect of the Alexander technique that fits into the body mind direction is body mapping.
Yeah, yeah.
On a very basic level, getting people to learn where their sits bones are, getting them to learn where the top of their spine is and what's going on up there, and C1 and C2 and the implications of all of
So
that.
it's interesting. Is that mind or body first? I'm not sure, because it's definitely coming from a cognitive place that
It
you're
is
learning about it, but
cognitive
you're
place. Yes.
experiencing it in yourself anyway.
But it can be done without any reference to things like Alexander technique directions, for example.
Mm.
You can teach body mapping and not mention anything about that, and people will benefit from it.
Yeah, I'm still skeptical whether I would say that's coming from the body, because it's a mental learning about,
It's bringing your,
So if I think sit bones, is that coming from my thinking, or is it it's my thinking?
yeah, I think, well, Barbara Conable, who's the she and her husband were the ones who really developed,
Mhm.
Bill Conable, her husband,
Mhm.
developed body mapping. I think she's the one who said that coined the phrase, the sort of basic law of human movement, that if your conception of what's going on in your body is out of line with the reality, then you're not going to move as efficiently as if it were in line. So, for
It's
example,
conception from
which
the,
is a thinking thing, yeah,
yeah.
but could be mainly unconscious,
Oh
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
you ask people like, well, where's your head moving relative to your torso or your neck? I mean, most people have never been asked this question before and
Yeah.
never thought about it. And when they do think about it, well, where is it happening? They'll often point on their head itself or
Yeah, yeah,
their
yeah,
neck,
yeah, yeah.
which is pretty far from where it's actually happening. So
So
their
I,
conception that's way out of line with the reality
Mhm.
of their
so
structure.
I think the fact that we're having this little discussion about this shows how difficult this idea of mind body or body mind is. What is what is coming first? It doesn't really matter actually, which comes, you know.
It's a murky,
Mhm.
complex field, and I think we're just scratching the surface. And I did leave out part of when I read that quote from Alexander in our first podcast. I left out some stuff that kind of is muddy. I won't say muddies it, but makes it even more complex. So
Is that for the next
I maybe, or
installment at some point? We'll get into the depths of
I
the
don't know,
murk,
but
or maybe not.
what I do hope, from both these two podcasts, this is being the second, is people coming up with some ideas of, for example, other things you can do from a body point of view, you could say, that are going to help the way you use yourself. I mean, that's
Mm.
what we're talking about. And yeah, that's really all I've got to say. Do you have you want
Yeah.
to say some more about any of this?
No, except I'd be curious if other people can think of other examples of
Yes.
where, especially from the Alexander technique itself, where um, the body might be the prime thing, which I do think in a hands-on lesson, even if there's a lot of thinking going on, I think that it's the body first.
Yes,
That's a controversial statement,
depending on
maybe.
the
Come back.
teacher, depending on the way the teacher's using what they're saying or not saying while
I
they're.
mean, if basically the lesson involves hands-on throughout, you know, rather than a lesson in which there might be a little bit of hands-on just to show a few things.
There are two examples that spring to mind when you say that. My first teacher did no explaining of anything, and there certainly were no directions or anything like that. He was just basically using his hands, which were quite good, to move you up and down out of a chair or table work. And I had huge changes happen from that very
So
quickly.
your use improved
Dramatic
without.
things happen, incredibly dramatic, but I didn't actually feel anything during the lessons, but outside of lessons, it was amazing. So that was he was kind of manipulating my body with some ideas of primary control, I'm sure, in the back of his mind, but he didn't mention any of that to me.
So you weren't getting any of the cognitive, the psycho
Zero, no,
stuff, the psycho.
yeah, no, zero.
And yet you were,
Changing dramatically.
which would have been changing how you were thinking and perceiving
Yeah,
the world. Yeah.
yeah,
Anyway.
absolutely. And the other example comes from Walter Carrington, who
Mm.
I had quite a few lessons with over the years I was in England. And, Walter was the master storyteller during a lesson. You'd go in there, and he'd start talking, and he would tell sort of a little story or stories that would end pretty much exactly 30 minutes later. And somehow that was that was helpful. But one of the things he said was when he had a new student, for the first 10 lessons at least, he would do anything in his power to keep anyone from talking about the Alexander technique.
So he was definitely going for the physical experience first, the
And
physical.
his clientele, private students, I think, was mostly older people. That's my sense. And I think he worked out that, well, that was the best way for him to help them, to just zap them for a bunch of lessons, and then start saying, well, you could think about this. You could use it direct. But now that's the opposite of how I work, but I can see it as powerful.
And for different people, the different direction will be better, so.
Hold off on directions, just get them to improve their use by just doing something, like getting into constructive position.
Yeah. When I said direction, then I meant working with just the body side of things.
Yeah.
Rather than the mind side of things.
That was definitely his approach. And yet he was very sophisticated in his understanding of directions and how people mess him up. He had very clear about that. He had very clear thinking about self-directing. But I think he felt for new students, he was better off not going that route until they'd had some direct physical experience. So he was kind of body, mind, and then maybe later mind, body, working with someone. So, all right. Anything else you want to say?
I don't think so for now, but just we'd be interested to hear from you.
Definitely want to hear from anyone who has thoughts on this and ideas for subsequent, because I think there might be a series of these on this topic. So my guest, and thank you, Imogen, is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll be posting a link to the previous podcast and a link to Imogen's website and a website where you can learn more about the Alexander Technique in general. So thank you so much.
Thank you.